If you're ever planning to stumble into a personal catastrophe, I highly recommend doing it on a Tuesday. Mondays have too much pressure, and weekends are just too crowded with brunches and optimism. But Tuesdays? Nobody expects a life-altering emotional landslide on a Tuesday. You get bonus points if it happens before breakfast, too. That particular Tuesday started with me kneeling on our living room carpet, elbow deep in a malfunctioning air purifier. Catherine claimed it made a noise like a dying squirrel trapped in a blender, which is the sort of visual Catherine excels at. Jerry, armed with a screwdriver and the misplaced confidence of a man who had watched half a YouTube tutorial, was determined to fix it. I wasn't doing it for the machine. I was doing it for the principle of marriage, a word that, at that very moment, I still believed applied to us. Catherine walked past me, heels clicking against the hardwood like a metronome for judgment, her expression unreadable and vaguely French. You know the kind, like she was simultaneously bored and offended by my continued existence. She didn't say anything. She just adjusted her coat and grabbed the keys to the Volvo like a woman auditioning for a role she'd already decided was beneath her. And off she went. I'll admit, I didn't think much of it. She'd been weird lately, yes, but Catherine being weird wasn't exactly breaking news. She was an abstract painter by education and a nonprofit consultant by employment, which basically meant she spent her days telling rich people how to donate money and her nights deciding whether something on a canvas was brilliant or just too obvious. She often concluded that the best art looked like a tantrum and cost more than my car. A mystery wrapped in silk scarves and obscure references to Scandinavian furniture designers. So when she left that morning without a word, I assumed it was just Catherine being Catherine. Maybe she was headed to a meeting. Maybe she was just annoyed about the air purifier. Maybe she'd finally gone to find that Danish coffee table that spoke to her but not in the right dialect. I didn't ask, and, in hindsight, I probably should have. It wasn't until I stood up, victorious over the now entirely non-functional air purifier, that I noticed something out of place. Not her phone. Not a hidden note. Nothing dramatic like that. No, I found a receipt. Now, I know what you're thinking, receipts are a tired plot device. But this wasn't some lipstick-stained scrap for champagne and oysters at a candlelit bistro. This was a receipt for a bowling ball. More specifically, a custom bowling ball. With the name Brett engraved on it. Brett. With one T. Already a red flag, right? I didn't recognize the name. Catherine had never mentioned a Brett. In our 14 years together, she'd mentioned a Brenda who stole her thesis idea in grad school and a Brian who ruined her 30th birthday by proposing to someone else during their mutual friend's party, but never a Brett. And definitely not a Brett who had worn a $200 personalized bowling ball in black and red Inferno swirl. Naturally, I did what any rational husband would do in that moment. I sat down on the couch with the receipt in my hand and stared into the middle distance like a man who just realized he's been cast in a play where everyone knows their lines except him. Catherine came home 3 hours later, hair flawless, coat freshly pressed, and her expression unbothered. She dropped her purse on the entryway table and breezed into the kitchen like we were in a commercial for overpriced countertops. I, now deeply curious about this Brett and his Inferno swirl, very casually mentioned that I'd found a receipt on the floor. She glanced at me, and I swear there was a microsecond, just the tiniest twitch at the corner of her mouth, before she said, "Oh, that's for work. A custom bowling ball. For work. Team building," she added, as if that clarified everything. "You know how it is." "Sure, Catherine. I, too, have spent many a corporate afternoon engraving sporting goods with a coworker's name and spending more on finger hole customization than I have on shoes." Now, I didn't press her. Not immediately. Because I'm not a moron. I've learned that if you give a liar enough rope, they'll either hang themselves or knit you a very incriminating sweater. Over the next few days, Brett became a fascinating figure in our household. He was never mentioned directly, of course, but I began noticing peculiar things. Catherine developed an interest in Monday nights, a time she'd previously reserved for berating HBO programming choices. She also began using a new phrase, the team, as in, the team is staying late tonight, or the team's trying out something new downtown. The team was suddenly very active. Then came the kicker. One evening, while looking for my spare glasses, which I now suspect Catherine relocated purely to increase plausible deniability, I found an envelope jammed behind the cookbooks we both pretended to use. Inside were several printed photos. Old school, glossy, oddly formal. Catherine and a man, presumably Brett, bowling, laughing, sharing nachos. his hand a little too low on her back. Her face lit up like she'd just been told she'd won a grant to curate an exhibit titled, "Why Monogamy is Just a Construct." Still, I didn't confront her. Not because I was afraid, okay, maybe a little, but because I needed to understand. I wasn't just chasing answers. I was auditing a marriage. So I did what I do best. I observed. Quietly. Creepily, perhaps. But when you're married to someone who's better at hiding secrets than the CIA, you start to appreciate the subtle art of amateur surveillance. And that's how, one quiet Thursday evening, I followed her, not in a trench coat or with binoculars, just in my very average Toyota Corolla with 3 unpaid parking tickets and a grudge. She wasn't headed to work, or yoga, or a gallery opening. No. Catherine drove to a nondescript building that, according to the sign, was the East Side Bowling League headquarters. A place that, until that very moment, I did not know existed. I parked, watched her enter, and waited. 35 minutes later, she exited, laughing, hair tousled, shoes swapped out for sneakers that didn't match her outfit at all. And behind her came a man. Brett, presumably. Hair like a backup guitarist from a 90s alt-rock band. Arms the size of my regrets. Carrying the Inferno swirl bowling ball like it was some sacred relic. I watched as she leaned in close, said something that made him laugh, then touched his arm in that very specific way, the way she used to touch mine before we became a cautionary tale. I didn't storm over. I didn't throw anything. I didn't cry. Instead, I drove home, sat in my garage, and listened to a podcast about home fermentation because, honestly, I needed something more predictable than Catherine. And that's how it started. That was the morning I lost my marriage. And the beginning of one very long Tuesday. The thing about pretending everything's fine is that eventually, the performance gets exhausting. There I was, 3 weeks after the bowling revelation, still waking up every morning and brushing my teeth next to the woman who once claimed shared bathrooms were where intimacy lives, and now wouldn't so much as pass me the toothpaste unless it was by accident. I was growing tired of playing the lead role in a play I hadn't auditioned for. A play called Let's See How Long Jerry Can Ignore the Fact That His Wife Is Spending More Time with a Man Named Brett than with her own reflection. Spoiler, not much longer. What finally tipped the scale wasn't Brett, or Catherine, or even the Inferno swirl bowling ball. It was my neighbor, Carl. Carl, bless his overly involved soul, was the kind of man who referred to himself in the third person and thought HOA meetings were a form of civic heroism. He once reported a suspicious hose placement on my front lawn. I nearly made him a commemorative plaque. One Sunday morning, Carl waved me down while I was pretending to trim the hedges. I say pretending because I wasn't actually cutting anything. I just needed a prop to avoid helping Catherine rearrange our living room for better flow, which, as far as I could tell, meant moving the couch 3 inches to the left so she could feel spiritually aligned with the coffee table. "Jerry," Carl bellowed, jogging across his yard with the enthusiasm of a man who still thought pineapple on pizza was edgy. "Saw Catherine yesterday with the bowling guy." I froze. The trimmers dangled awkwardly from my hand like I just remembered I had bones. "Bowling guy?" I asked, already bracing for Carl's usual avalanche of unsolicited trivia. "Yeah, Brett, right? Saw him and Catherine loading something into the back of his truck outside that weird community center by the highway. You know, the one with all the posters about indoor archery and salsa dancing for seniors." I didn't. I barely knew where Catherine kept the spare batteries. "Huh," I said, attempting the exact amount of interest that would get Carl to walk away. But Carl, being Carl, wasn't finished. "Thought you guys were doing one of those couples leagues or something. Looked pretty official. Matching shirts and everything." Matching shirts. Catherine and I couldn't agree on a dish towel color, and now she was coordinating wardrobe with another man for what I could only assume was a bowling-centered fantasy league built on betrayal and polycotton blends. "Yeah, it's a thing we're trying," I said, which wasn't technically a lie. I was definitely trying. Mostly to not set our washer-dryer unit on fire out of spite. Carl gave me a thumbs up, told me to keep rolling strikes, and jogged off to go reposition his recycling bins in a way he believed deterred raccoons. Again, too much enthusiasm, not enough hobbies. That night, I asked Catherine about it. "You and Brett have matching shirts now?" I said casually, sipping from the mug I reserve for pretending I'm less sarcastic than I am. She blinked, that slow, calculated blink she always did when she was mentally editing the sentence she was about to say. "It's part of the league," she replied. "What league?" "The mixed adult-friendly casual one. Not even an acronym." I was impressed. Lying is easy. Lying with invented bureaucratic structure is an art. I thought it was just team building, I said, because apparently I was now the director of passive-aggressive dialogue. Catherine shrugged. Well, it was, but then we figured we'd formalize it a bit. Formalize. Like their relationship had filed for an LLC. I didn't ask anything else. Mostly because I was worried the next answer would involve custom socks or synchronized handshakes. Instead, I began collecting data. Not the high-tech kind, no spyware, no tracking devices, no trench coats and bushes. Just the old-fashioned observation kind. Catherine had always been predictable, which is the most insulting part of all of this. You'd think if someone was going to derail a marriage, they'd at least do it with some flair. But no, she was so boring about it. It felt like I was being cheated on by a PowerPoint presentation. She left the house every Thursday at 6:15 sharp, said it was practice. She came back at 8:40, sometimes later. Occasionally, she had glitter on her face. I never figured out if that was bowling-related or just Catherine's natural way of reflecting her inner delusion. One Thursday, I followed her. Not in a creepy way, just to the parking lot. She parked. She met Brett. They hugged. Brett opened the trunk of his truck and revealed several laminated folders and a whiteboard with names on it. This wasn't just bowling. This was organized bowling. Catherine had willingly joined a club. The woman who once claimed structure was the enemy of creativity was now participating in a league with color-coded charts. For a man who once had to lie to her about alphabetizing the spice rack just to avoid a 45-minute lecture on spice energy, this felt like treason. It got weirder. One Saturday afternoon, while she was out running errands for 3 hours, I received a very polite email from a woman named Judy. Judy ran the local rec center's club night showcase and was confirming that Catherine and Brett were scheduled to perform a demonstration of bowling dance fusion at next month's event. I read the email 3 times. Bowling. Dance. Fusion. I replied and said I was thrilled, then spent the next 20 minutes trying to visualize what exactly fusion meant. Interpretive strikes? Choreographed spares? Was Brett dipping Catherine after every frame? I needed answers. But more than that, I needed Catherine to know that I knew, without actually having to tell her I knew. Because if there was one thing I learned about my wife, it's that direct confrontation was like feeding a raccoon espresso, chaotic, messy, and likely to end in an argument about semantics. So I left the email open on our shared iPad. On purpose. She saw it that evening. Her reaction was a masterclass in restraint. Oh, she said, setting the iPad down like it had personally insulted her. That came early. Judy seems organized, I replied. She is, Catherine said, a little too quickly. She's very enthusiastic. Bowling dance fusion, I said, slowly, tasting each word like a man sampling regret. It's, just something fun. That's a lot of fun, I said. You should get matching pants. She didn't laugh. Just stared at me with the same expression she used when our tax guy asked about the missing receipts from 2021. From that moment on, something shifted. Catherine became slightly colder. Not full-on glacier mode, but definitely not tropical breeze either. I could feel it. She knew I knew something. And I knew she knew I knew something. But we both pretended not to know what we knew, which made dinners taste like tension with a side of awkward. The next few days were a silent standoff. A polite Cold War. She watered plants with unnecessary vigor. I hummed aggressively while folding laundry. Neither of us brought up bowling. Or Brett. Or fusion of any kind. But something was brewing. And it wasn't just resentment. Catherine had a very particular way of showing guilt, by doing extremely uncharacteristic things, like offering to help with the garage. Now, you don't need to know a lot about my wife to understand how strange that is. Catherine volunteering for garage-related activities was like your dentist asking if they can braid your hair. Completely unrelated to her usual interests and slightly suspicious. I just feel like we need a fresh start out there, she said one Saturday morning, hands on hips, surveying the chaotic blend of paint cans, holiday decorations, and tools I never used but refused to throw out. A fresh start. I repeated, because when your wife starts talking in vague inspirational slogans, you're either about to be in an infomercial or a deeply uncomfortable conversation. She nodded, already moving some boxes that hadn't been moved since the Obama administration. It just feels cluttered. Doesn't it feel cluttered to you? I didn't respond. Mostly because I wasn't sure whether she was talking about the garage or our marriage, and honestly, both felt accurate. So there we were, reorganizing the garage like a normal couple that hadn't been circling a silent argument for weeks. I knew what she was doing. She thought manual labor would serve as some kind of distraction/reconciliation attempt. Hey, we're fine. Look at us working together like we're on a home improvement show situation. Unfortunately for her, I was still me. By mid-afternoon, we'd made questionable progress. Most of it involved Catherine silently deciding what belonged in the keep pile and what would be donated to a thrift store to confuse some unlucky customer. I stood there holding a broken lamp from her college apartment that I once got scolded for calling a fire hazard with artistic ambition. She took it from me with the air of someone reluctantly letting go of an ex-boyfriend's hoodie. I guess we don't need it anymore, she said, her voice soft, like this was supposed to be a moment. Makes sense, I replied. You've already got a new team lighting up your life. She froze. Not dramatically, but just enough to let me know she understood that I wasn't just talking about the lamp. What's that supposed to mean? Do you want me to list all the things it could mean? Or should I stick to the one involving custom bowling shirts and Thursday nights? She set the lamp down a little too carefully, like she was buying time. Jerry, I don't know what kind of conclusions you're jumping to. Let's not insult the little intelligence I have left, I said. You're not exactly subtle. You've been organizing your life around Brett like he's a conference call that might change your career. Her eyes narrowed, just slightly. If you were really paying attention, you'd know Brett's barely part of it. I raised an eyebrow. Well, that's comforting. So there are others. Catherine rolled her eyes, which in Catherine speak meant, you're being annoying but unfortunately not wrong. She walked to the garage door, paused with her hand on the frame, and then, instead of storming out, turned around like she was ready to defend a thesis she barely believed in. Do you ever wonder why this happened? She asked. Because you joined a bowling league? I mean us, Jerry. Do you ever think about us? I shrugged. Only when you leave a trail of glitter across the living room rug. She sighed like someone who just realized the wine was non-alcoholic. You've been checked out for a long time. I pointed at myself. I'm the one standing in a garage on a Saturday pretending we care about paint cans from 2013. Seems pretty checked in. This isn't about the garage. Then maybe don't use the garage as your emotional stage. We stared at each other for a moment. The silence wasn't dramatic. It was just awkward. The kind of silence where both people know too much and care too little to fake another round of pretend normal. Then I went for it. Catherine, are you involved with Brett? She blinked. Define involved. Is he under the impression he's in a relationship with my wife? I think he knows I'm married. That's not the question. She scratched the side of her neck, a nervous habit I'd only ever seen during tax season and once when she dropped her phone in the toilet. It's complicated. Is it? Because from my side, it looks pretty simple. You're emotionally commuting to someone else's front porch and coming home just to check the mail. That's dramatic. You're confusing dramatic with observant. And there it was. Not a confession. Not an apology. Just silence. Again, I nodded slowly, hands on my hips. So let me guess. It's my fault for being boring. For liking routines. For being the guy who never needed a Thursday night league to feel alive. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. I got the newsletter. Catherine's Guide to Justifying Emotional Affairs comes with footnotes and a playlist, I assume. She crossed her arms. This isn't working, Jerry. Glad we finally agree on something. We didn't fight. We didn't yell. We didn't throw anything or slam doors. We just stood there, in our halfway organized garage, surrounded by plastic bins full of memories and junk we didn't have the energy to deal with. Eventually, she walked inside. I stayed. I stood there, staring at the ridiculous stack of things labeled fragile with handwriting I suddenly resented. And I laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because it was absurd in the most dull, domestic way possible. Catherine had replaced a marriage with bowling. And somehow, that made more sense than anything she could have said. When it came time to retaliate, I didn't reach for anything dramatic. There was no grand scheme, no scheming music playing in the background, and no spreadsheet marked Operation Payback. Honestly, I wasn't angry in the way people expect you to be when your spouse decides to emotionally relocate to someone else's bowling league. I wasn't about to pour sugar in anyone's gas tank or buy a billboard with a petty quote. I just wanted Catherine to experience what she clearly hadn't in years, a dose of honest clarity. The first step was the calendar. Our shared calendar, to be exact. We'd used it religiously, color-coded, categorized, and borderline obsessive. If Catherine so much as scheduled a haircut, it went in there. Now, I was the only one checking it, so I decided to make it a little more interactive. I started adding events. Monday, 7 p.m., reminder, Catherine is emotionally sponsored by Brett. Wednesday, 6:30 p.m., local art exhibit, lies told in matching shirts. Friday, 8 p.m., Jerry enjoys not being talked down to. Saturday, 3 p.m., consult lawyer. No, not because I'm dramatic. It took her 4 days to notice. I know this because I heard her mutter, "Oh, come on," from the living room and then type aggressively for 3 straight minutes. She didn't delete the events, though. She just stopped using the calendar. That was fine. Phase 1 was never about participation. It was about disruption, a gentle poke to her curated reality. Next, I turned my attention to our home, our shared, perfectly neutral tones with one splash of teal home. Catherine had spent 3 years shaping our interior to match the aesthetic of a lifestyle blogger who reviews expensive vases. Every inch of our place screamed, "We live here, but in a very curated way." It was the kind of house where the couch was mostly for decoration and the chairs were exclusively for guests who knew not to spill. I didn't destroy anything. I just edited. One evening while she was out, likely doing very serious league-related activities, I swapped our framed quote in the hallway from "In this house we laugh often" to "In this house we gaslight selectively." She walked past it for a full 2 days before it clicked. Then came the bookshelf. Catherine had organized it by color and size, a decision she once defended with the phrase, "It calms the eye." I reordered it by subject, then by author, then again by the emotional damage each book had caused me in high school. It looked chaotic. It looked like someone had actually read the books. In short, it looked like I lived there. She came home, stared at it for 25 seconds, opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again and walked off. Victory in silence. Phase 3 required a bit more finesse. See, Catherine had a thing for online image curation. Not selfies, exactly, she hated being called basic, but subtle lifestyle shots. Our coffee table with an untouched latte next to a book she hadn't read. A candle burning near a blanket we never used. She tagged them with captions like, "Simple moments" or "Craving quiet today." So I began staging my own moments. I'd casually leave a random object half in frame, like a single sock or a bill with her bowling league dues highlighted. One morning, I replaced her caption post with, "Simple moments of emotional detachment." She didn't notice for 3 hours, then removed it and changed her password. That was fine. The point had been made. And then there was the board. Catherine had once installed a corkboard in our kitchen, ostensibly for important notes. But she used it like a personal museum exhibit. Invitations, postcards, inspirational quotes she found cleansing. I added a note of my own. New exhibit opening this weekend. Disappointment, a retrospective. Curated by Catherine, featuring the emotional range of a bowling ball. She left it up for a week. I think she thought it was clever. Or maybe she was too busy bowling to care. At work, I started using my full lunch breaks. I know that doesn't sound like much, but it was revolutionary. Catherine used to call them wasted opportunities for productivity. Now, I ate lunch like a person with nothing to prove. I started going to the library again. Not to read, just to sit. It felt like the kind of place where silence wasn't awkward, it was the main attraction. A colleague of mine, Amanda, noticed I was less stressed. She asked if I'd started meditating. I told her, no, my wife emotionally outsourced our marriage to a man named Brett, and I stopped pretending that's normal. She paused, blinked, then said, "Well, that's one way to achieve mindfulness." Eventually, Catherine noticed that I'd stopped checking in. No more, "What time will you be home?" No more, "Did you get the mail?" I let her exist without commentary, which for someone like Catherine was worse than confrontation. She started leaving out bait. A new haircut. A suspiciously philosophical book on the nightstand. A long sigh during dinner. But I didn't bite. I simply passed the salt. At one point, she asked if I wanted to go to one of her league matches. I smiled and said, "I think you've got plenty of support already." She didn't ask again. Then, I did the thing that rattled her most. I started organizing my own Thursday nights. Nothing dramatic. I didn't post about it or make a big deal. I just left. She'd come home, and I wouldn't be there. No note. No explanation. I became what she had been, unavailable. The first time, she sent a text, "Out?" I replied, "Yep." The second time, she didn't bother asking. The third time, she waited up. I walked in at 10:15. She was in the kitchen, holding a mug like it had answers. "Where were you?" I shrugged. "Out." "Out where?" "Just out." She tilted her head. "With someone?" "With people." She blinked, visibly calculating whether this counted as a threat. "Anything I should know?" "Nope," I said. "But thanks for finally asking." I walked past her. She didn't follow. And that's how it worked. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I didn't play her game. I just flipped the board over and handed her the pieces. She could play alone now. It was a Wednesday. Not symbolic, not meaningful. Just the day I happened to sit on the couch and realize I couldn't stand that couch anymore. Not because of how it looked. It was neutral, expensive, and had all the personality of a politely written email, but because of what it represented. That couch had hosted 3 years of polite distance, 11 arguments disguised as home decor debates, and one very elaborate discussion about whether muted green was a legitimate color. That couch had seen it all, and I decided it was finally time one of us left. Spoiler, it wasn't going to be the couch. Catherine walked in around 6, exactly 23 minutes after I got home. She looked mildly surprised to see me sitting there, still in my button-up shirt, not moving, not faking it anymore. She tilted her head, the way she always did when she was deciding whether to pretend she was confused or just act confused outright. "You're home early," she said, which was true, but not relevant. "I'm sitting on the couch," I replied. "It's the most productive thing I've done all week." She put down her keys like she was placing a fragile object onto a museum pedestal. Everything with Catherine was calculated. How she moved, what she wore, when she decided to be interested in a conversation. And that night, it was clear she decided it was time to act like a concerned spouse again. What a treat. "Is everything okay?" "No. But thanks for the check-in after 6 weeks of ambient tension and selective eye contact." She didn't flinch. Catherine had developed a high tolerance for sarcasm. I assumed it was how she justified staying married to me for as long as she did. Or maybe she was just using me as material for an experimental short story. She sat in the armchair across from me. Not next to me. Not diagonally. Straight across. Like we were about to negotiate a merger or review quarterly performance metrics. "Jerry," she said, with the tone people use when they're about to use your name too much. "We've been off." "Oh?" And here I was thinking this was just a charming new phase where you emotionally relocated without giving me a forwarding address. Catherine took a deep breath. Not a dramatic one, just enough to signal she was about to try sounding reasonable. Which, of course, meant nothing reasonable was going to follow. "Look," she began. "I never intended for things to feel this divided. Right? It just happened. Like a thunderstorm. Or a burrito exploding in the microwave." She ignored that. "We stopped connecting. That's not on just one of us." "I agree," I said. "You were emotionally unavailable, and I was too busy working and trying to decode your cryptic sighs." That made her wince. "Progress. I'm not saying what I did, what I might have done, was okay," she continued, which was Catherine speak for, "I definitely did something, but I prefer to discuss it in vague theoretical terms." I leaned back. "Catherine, I'm not interested in the legal disclaimer. I don't need the carefully phrased version of what you think happened. I know what happened. You started bowling. Then you started bowling with purpose. And then you started bowling with Brett. That's not fair. Neither is pretending you were just building community every time you came home glowing with team spirit." She paused, probably trying to remember the last time she felt like she had the upper hand in a conversation. That moment had clearly passed. "Do you want to separate?" she asked, not softly, not dramatically. Just asked. "No," I said, "I want a refund." She almost smiled at that, which would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. "I didn't mean for it to get like this," she said, looking not at me, but somewhere near the corner of the room. "I just kept thinking it was temporary, that I was figuring things out." "I think you figured them out just fine," I replied. "The problem is, you forgot to tell me I wasn't part of the final version." There was another silence. "We were good at those. Champions, really." Then she finally looked at me again. "So what do we do now?" It was a fair question. After months of slow detachment, weird routines, calendar warfare, and unspoken truths, there wasn't a guidebook for whatever this was. "I don't want to be in a marriage where we communicate through decorative throw pillows," I said. "I don't want to spend the next 10 years pretending this was just a blip. I'm not interested in rebuilding something that doesn't make sense anymore." She nodded, not fast, but firmly. Like someone who had just been told a diagnosis they suspected was coming. "I think we need to end it," she said. I didn't react. I just sat there, because hearing it from her mouth didn't sting. It just confirmed what I'd already felt in every awkward dinner and mismatched bedtime. "Agreed," I said. "And no offense, but I'd like to not do the fake grace and elegance version of this. No, we just grew apart speeches. No blaming schedules. Let's just admit it. You got bored, I got tired, and Brett had free Thursdays." She actually laughed. A small, sad laugh, but it was something. Can we do this like adults? She asked. That depends. Are you planning on writing a blog post about it with filtered photos and the phrase conscious uncoupling? No, she said, cracking a real smile this time. That feels too symmetrical. Good. Because nothing about this has been symmetrical. You got the glitter. I got the passive aggression. We talked logistics after that. Who would take what, how to split things, what we'd tell friends. It was surprisingly smooth. Maybe because the worst part wasn't ending it. It was living through the part where we didn't admit it was already over. When she left the room, I stayed on the couch. Not for closure or reflection or any poetic nonsense like that. I stayed because I was finally comfortable. Not emotionally. Just physically. The couch was still terrible, but at least now it was honest about it. A week after we decided to part ways, I found myself sitting in the DMV, not because I needed to renew anything, but because it was the quietest place I could think of where no one would talk to me unless it was to mispronounce my last name. Also, because they had chairs. My apartment, at that point, didn't. I'd moved into a 2-bedroom unit above a nail salon that played soft jazz versions of pop hits from the 2000s. That first night, I lay awake listening to a flute version of Hot and Harry and briefly questioned every decision I had ever made. The second night, I downloaded earplugs and leaned into the experience. By night 3, I was humming along. Adaptation, not just for nature documentaries anymore. The place was fine. There were cabinets, a functioning toilet, enough space for my clothes, half of our mismatched dinnerware, and a folding table I'd convinced myself would eventually be replaced by something that didn't look like it came from a church basement. I'd even bought a lamp that was trying very hard to be modern, but looked like it was designed by someone who misunderstood both geometry and light. Catherine didn't call. She didn't text. She sent one email the day after the move, with the subject line, keys and garage opener. I replied, on your porch. That was the extent of our communication. It wasn't hostile. It was just complete. I didn't feel rage, or heartbreak, or whatever emotional package people expect after a breakup. Mostly, I felt like I'd just finished a really long group project where only one person did the work and the other person got the credit for attending meetings and matching shirts. My coworkers tried to help. Some offered to set me up with friends who had great energy or knew how to laugh. Others assumed I'd suddenly become deeply interested in hiking. I went on one of those hikes. It ended with me staring at a rock and trying to figure out why everyone was pretending this counted as fun. The rock had more personality than most of the conversation. A few days later, I got an invite to Catherine's upcoming exhibition. Apparently, she decided to return to her creative roots. The exhibit was called Echoes of Disconnection. It featured, according to the flyer, a series of mixed media interpretations of emotional distance. I almost RSVP'd just to see how she planned to frame bread in a sculpture without making it look like a bowling trophy. But I decided against it. Some things are better left as punchlines in your own head. Instead, I started taking photos of mildly chaotic grocery store signs and texting them to no one. It felt like a better use of my sense of humor. Lettuce, buy one, confuse yourself for free. Honestly, that one deserved a wider audience. People kept asking me how I was doing, and I never gave the same answer twice. Not because I was unstable, but because I figured honesty was overrated in these conversations. You say, fine, and they nod like they understand. You say, liberated, and they think you joined a cult. I settled on between things, which made me sound like I had either just left a band or was considering opening a pottery studio. About a month in, I finally unpacked the last box, full of random cords, user manuals for appliances I no longer owned, and a notebook labeled Catherine's Brainstorm Journal. It was filled with ideas that never made it past the page. One act plays about quiet elevators, conceptual art pieces involving laundry baskets, an outline for a podcast she said would expose the dishonest architecture of domestic life. I closed the notebook, put it in a drawer, and didn't think about it again. That's not bitterness. That's reality. When you live with someone long enough, they don't just leave the house. They leave layers. Not dramatic, haunting ones, just ordinary, forgettable traces. Like the setting on the thermostat or the way the knives point in the drawer. You don't miss them. You just notice them. My neighbor, Kevin, a man with more potted plants than social interactions, asked me recently if I felt whole again. I told him I wasn't a pothole. He laughed like he understood, then offered me a zucchini. I declined. Some boundaries matter. I started writing again. Nothing serious. Notes. Observations. Rankings of public benches based on lumbar support. I posted a few online under a fake name. One got picked up by a newsletter about modern manhood, which sounded suspiciously like a podcast that would yell at you about protein shakes. Still, they paid me $75, and I used it to buy a chair that didn't fold. I ran into Brett once, at a hardware store. He was buying paint. I was buying tape. We made eye contact, and for a moment, I wondered if he'd say something, apologize, explain, offer me free bowling lessons. He didn't. He looked at me the way you look at someone you've seen in a dream but can't place in real life. I nodded. He nodded. We moved on. That was probably for the best. What was there to say? Thanks for the unsolicited marriage audit? Glad Catherine found someone who understands emotional metaphors and the correct way to hold a bowling ball? No thanks. We were good. If there's anything I came away with from this whole experience, it's this. People don't always leave with a bang. Sometimes they just quietly fade out while wearing matching polyester shirts. Sometimes they show you who they are through team rosters and rec center schedules. And sometimes you find out who you are in the process of watching them drift. I'm not wiser. I'm not stronger. I'm just clearer. The couch in my new place is small and comfortable. No metaphors. Just good lumbar. I don't use shared calendars anymore. I write things down on scraps of paper and stick them to my fridge. They don't sync with anything, but they're mine. As for love, or whatever you want to call the thing people chase through dating apps and shared playlists, I'm not chasing it. If it wants to find me, it can bring snacks and a sense of humor. Otherwise, I'm perfectly okay ranking benches. And that's it. No dramatic send-off. No emotional playlist. Just me, Jerry, between things. And surprisingly, that's not a bad place to be. Thanks for watching. Rate the story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel